What's up, my chemistry students? It's Mrs. Thompson here, and today we're going over electrochemistry. Electrochemistry is based on oxidation and reduction. Here you have a picture of the person who kind of started electrochemistry, and that is Luigi Galvani. And so what Luigi Galvani was studying is he was studying frog legs. What he found was that if he stuck a metal rod through the frog and he touched that metal with a different metal, the frog's legs moved apart. They almost contracted because of the nerves and the muscles that are in there. He thought that energy must come from the actual frog itself. So he had this animal energy idea. Okay. Count Alessandro Volta found Galvani's experiment to be very interesting, and he had a different opinion about where that energy came from. He thought it might come from the two metals touching each other. And so what he did is he created this thing, and it's the first battery. It's called a pile, and what it is a pile of different metal discs, copper and zinc. And in between those discs, there is a piece of salt-soaked cardboard, and it allows the electrons to flow, creating the very first battery. All right, so here's the definition. Electrochemistry is the study of the relationship between the chemical potential energy, that's the stored energy that the chemicals have in them before they react, and the electrical energy. So those are the electrons that are moving. So moving electrons make electricity. There are two types of electrochemical cells. There's the galvanic cell and the electrolytic cell. Now the galvanic cell is a reaction that happens spontaneously. So no outside intervention. Electrons just travel on their own. The delta G for this, remember Gibbs free energy, would be negative because there would be that extra energy to do work. The electrolytic cell is non-spontaneous. Another source has to come in to provide the electricity in order to run this cell. And so you see this picture here, it's plugged into the wall. The delta G for that one would be positive. All right, it produces electricity, that's the galvanic cell. Because it happens spontaneously, the electrons flow on its own. Whereas the electrolytic cell requires energy for this to happen. The galvanic cell needs two different containers to keep two different solutions separate. Okay? The electrolytic cell can be done in one container. An example of a galvanic cell would be a battery. Okay? This is a dry cell battery, not so much like this one. This is another type of battery we'll talk about. And electrolytic cells this could be something like the electrolysis of water, the separation of water into hydrogen and oxygen. Another thing is electroplating different metals. So you can purify metals this way and get them to attach to a plate, like putting silver onto steel. We're only going to focus on the galvanic cell. That was the cell that ran spontaneously and created electricity. This is also called the voltaic cell, named after Alessandro Volta. Here's your basic galvanic cell setup. We have two different half cells. The half cells have different pulls for electrons. So one side is pulling on the electrons stronger than the other side, so it steals those electrons from that side. And as it steals the electrons, that flow of electrons, that's electricity, the electron flow, creates a current. And that's what we're looking for with a galvanic cell. In this example of a galvanic cell, we're using zinc as the anode and zinc sulfate, and the cathode is copper and copper sulfate. We'll talk about anodes and cathodes in a moment. Now in here, I could have different metals and different metal solutions. This is just an example. All right, so inside of the containers on each side of the cell, we have 1 molar concentrations of those solutions, and those solutions break up. They're aqueous, they dissolve in water, they break up into their ions. We also have an electrode, so that's a metal electrode that's usually the same as the metal that's in the aqueous solution. We need a wire to run from one electrode to the other electrode so that the electrons have a place to flow through. So there's that purple part, that's the wire. This cell also needs a salt bridge to help balance out the charge. Here's why. Because as the electrons flow from one side to another, this side, losing its electrons, starts to become very positive. And so we don't want that to happen, because if this side's too positive and this side's too negative, there's no reason for the electrons to keep flowing. And so instead, the ions travel through that salt bridge. So we'll draw one in on this one. It also says here that if electrons are moving, ions need to move also. And so the positive ions will flow in the same direction as the electrons. And so the electrons are moving this way, so the positive ions that are in this salt bridge will move in that same direction, so that it kind of cancels out that negative flow over here. So that way. We can use something called a voltmeter to measure the electrical current that's flowing from anode to cathode. Now, the amount of current is going to depend on how much one side is greater at pulling the electrons than the other. If there's a big difference in that pull, then you're going to get lots of volts and lots of electrons flowing through. If there's only a small difference between the anode and the cathode side, then it's going to be very little volts that are coming through. All right, so here's what we need to know about electrodes. Electrodes are a solid surface at which oxidation or reduction half reactions occur. There's the anode and the cathode. The anode is where the oxidation occurs. Now, as oxidation is happening, it's losing electrons. Remember, Leo goes Ger. And so as it loses electrons, the metal, which was solid at first, now becomes in the ion form. And so it dissolves right into the solution instead of being part of the metal. And so you see in this animation that the anode is disappearing. The cathode is going through reduction. And so it's going from being an ion in solution to being a solid metal. And so what happens to the cathode is it actually gains in mass as those solidify onto the actual cathode electrode. Here's what that would look like. So here's the zinc electrode after, and here's the copper cathode after. It's gained mass. The zinc anode has lost mass. Electrons will always flow from anode to cathode. The cathode will be positive and the anode will be negative. The positive ions, remember, will flow in the same direction as the electrons, and they're going through the salt bridge. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to offset the negative electrons that have moved over. If the positive ions are flowing in the same direction as the electrons, which way do you think the negative ions are going to flow? Okay, they're going to flow towards the anode. All right, so what happens to the anode and the cathode? We wrote this down before, but I would like you to write this down on the diagram. The anode shrinks and the cathode grows. Here's a few mnemonic devices to help you memorize what is occurring at the cathode and anode. All right, so it's anox and a red cat. Anox for anode oxidation, red cat for reduction cathode. The other one is fat cat. So why fat cat? That's because the electrons in the voltaic cell always flow from anode to cathode. All right. You can also remember that it is the cat that is the one that is hungry for electrons. Okay, it's gaining electrons, and so it is getting bigger too. It's a fat cat. All right, we will work on this some more, including calculating cell potential and actually trying to figure out which one goes in the anode and which one goes in the cathode.